We can trace the origin of Western philosophy to a specific intellectual shift, the attempt to explain the universe without relying on mythology. The earliest Greek thinkers observed the chaotic multiplicity of the world and asked a structural question: what is the arche? They defined this as the single, original starting point from which all reality generates. These naturalists looked outward, focusing entirely on isolating the physical building blocks of the cosmos. Thinkers like Thales argued the source was water. Others pointed to fire or air. They posited that these elemental materials interacted through blind mechanical forces. Things combined and separated not by divine decree, but driven by necessity, strife, or love. This model successfully categorized the physical mechanics of the natural world. It proved that the cosmos operated according to observable, predictable laws. The zooming in from the macro level of celestial bodies to the micro level of human civilization exposes a severe limitation. The intricate, constructed reality of a city-state like Athens requires laws, governance, and moral judgments. The pre-Socratics successfully identified what the physical world was made of. Their cosmology, however, provided absolutely no instruction on how a human being ought to live within it. Decades later, Aristotle would retroactively expose the exact logical gap in his predecessors' thinking. He targeted their reliance on what he called the material cause. The material cause is simply the underlying physical stuff that comprises an object: the raw wood, the solid stone, or the bronze. Aristotle's objection was straightforward. Underlying matter possesses zero capacity to initiate its own change. This diagram represents a raw block of material. Left to itself, raw timber will never spontaneously organize into a bed. Likewise, raw bronze won't spontaneously forge into a statue. Inert matter requires an external moving force, a craftsman with a specific design, to impose structure. Aristotle applied this physical critique directly to the human condition. Just as raw timber requires a carpenter to achieve its final form, human life requires a guiding, deliberate principle to achieve its intended purpose. Mapping the physics of fire and water yields zero data on the design of a functioning society, the mechanics of justice, or the definition of a good life. Because the material universe is blind and inert, the ultimate first principle of human existence has to be found entirely outside of physical matter. The focal point of philosophy had to shift. That pivot arrived with Socrates. He redirected the rigorous analytical methods of the early naturalists away from the heavens and pointed them straight inward, toward the human soul. He operated in an Athens heavily influenced by the Sophists. They taught that moral truths were merely social conventions, entirely relative to whoever held power. Socrates rejected this relativism by pointing to the concept of specialized expertise. He argued that society naturally defers to experts for practical problems. We hire trained shipbuilders to construct a fleet, and we consult physicians to cure a fever. Logic dictates we must also require trained experts to govern the moral health of the soul. To achieve that expertise, Socrates refused to accept mere lists of examples. If asked about justice, he did not want a catalog of specific fair transactions or courageous battles. He demanded the exact structural definition of the concept itself. He was searching for its being, the universal, unchanging essence or form that makes every individual instance of a virtue recognizable. This formal being stood in sharp contrast to the physical becoming of the materialists, whose elemental universe was constantly fluctuating. Socrates demanded absolute precision. He treated moral concepts with the same analytical rigor that a geometrician applies to a triangle. By demanding objective definitions, he elevated ethics into a science. He established that the human soul possesses an internal architecture that is just as rigid and real as the physical laws of the cosmos. To map this architecture, Socrates developed an algorithmic method of cross-examination called the elenchus. It was designed to stress test the structural integrity of his opponent's beliefs. We can see the method in this diagram, tracking an exchange from the Republic. In step 1, Socrates asks for a definition. His interlocutor, Polemarchus, confidently supplies a conventional answer. Justice is helping your friends and harming your enemies. In step 2, Socrates temporarily accepts this definition, then begins mapping Polemarchus's other deeply held beliefs through seemingly peripheral questions. First, Socrates secures agreement on a foundational premise that a just man is, by definition, a good man. Next, he asks about the operational nature of goodness. Is it ever the function of a good thing, like a skilled doctor or an expert horse trainer, to damage its subject? Polemarchus agrees it is never their function to cause harm. This is step 3, the trap. The interlocutor established a firm rule that a good man never harms anyone. The logic directly collides. If a just man is good and never causes harm, the original definition, harming enemies, is structurally impossible. This logical collapse induces a specific psychological state known as aporia, a profound, paralyzing realization of one's own ignorance. The men Socrates cross-examined frequently walked away humiliated, frustrated, and angry at having their worldviews dismantled. Yet inducing aporia was never a rhetorical parlor trick. It was a required epistemological clearing of the ground. A person will never seek out the objective truth of a concept as long as they retain false confidence in their unexamined, conventional opinions. The elenchus functions as a vital intellectual filter. Finding the universal truth requires systematically destroying the logical contradictions built into our baseline assumptions. Once the destructive work of the elenchus clears the field, Socrates moves toward a constructive conclusion in the Republic. He ultimately rejects every definition that categorizes justice strictly as a transactional behavior, a social contract, or a set of external actions. In this diagram, we see his breakthrough. Justice is an internal state of being, the correct structural arrangement of the soul. True justice occurs when the psyche's varied elements, reason, spirit, and appetite, stop meddling and fall into perfect, harmonious alignment. This internal self-rule is the absolute prerequisite. A person cannot perform a genuinely just external action until their internal architecture is regulated. This discovery answers the exact deficit left behind by the pre-Socratic materialists. Socrates proved that human ethics and morality are not random conventions. They are governed by structural principles that are as absolute and discoverable as the physical elements driving the cosmos. By moving the search for first principles away from the material universe and focusing it entirely on the formal essence of the soul, he established the foundation of moral philosophy. The legacy of the Socratic shift is a stark instruction. Categorizing the mechanics of the external world yields nothing if a person has not first mastered the structural integrity of themselves.